Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty busy these days.
Well, we're so grateful that you could take time to share your views with us. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are David Corn. You need no introduction, such as the stature you have reached.
Thanks to Blogging Heads TV.
Almost entirely, but
I think so.
less than
I walk through airports and people stop me to.
Hey, that happens. You know what?
And they go, "Yeah, we know you from Blogging Heads TV."
You know what? Matt Lewis has had a couple of people who aren't aware that he's on CNN, but say, "Hey, I know you from Blogging Heads." So don't make light of that possibility, whether or not it's actually happened to you.
It has happened.
I have been
once.
I'll tell you, I have been in D.C. having coffee with you when someone walked up to you. Now, granted, this was 9 years ago, but said, "I saw you on Blogging Heads TV."
I paid him $5. Sorry to tell you that, Bob.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised, I guess. So, this actually may go on Meaning of Life TV, not Blogging Heads TV.
Okay.
Meaning of Life is Blogging Head's sister site, although it will be on the Blogging Heads homepage, as is all Meaning of Life content. Let me explain why it kind of belongs on Meaning of Life. First, in case anyone has forgotten who you are, which seems unlikely.
But I think I can guess. Since this election is so absurd, we're applying this to a channel named after Monty Python movies.
That's not exactly correct.
Am I close?
You're close.
Okay.
So we are, and you are, by the way, Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones, author of Hubris and Showdown, and relevantly broke the Mitt Romney 47% story 4 years ago, but we'll return to that. It's actually very relevant because it gets to what this is about. So we're going to talk about Trump, but this is not usual horse race Trump. This is not the kind of stuff that you do on cable TV where you are such a frequent presence. This is actually, if you can believe this, David, we're going to go deeper than they go on the cable news shows. If you can imagine such a thing.
It staggers the imagination.
But we're going to try. We will probably fail. It's so unattainable does that goal seem. But rather than talk about the horse race, we are going to explore the roots of Trumpism, talk about what motivates Trump's supporters, which, after all, is kind of a mystery, I think, to some people of roughly our ideological persuasion. We're going to try to, exercise what psychologists call cognitive empathy, which is not like identifying with people suffering emotionally or anything like that, just understanding how the world looks to them.
Yes.
Okay, and look at the broader forces underlying Trumpism, the broader implications. This is going to be cosmic. But first, have I said that enough time? But first, before we get to I want to start with Hillary's basket of deplorables remark, because this is her theory of Trump. I mean, I want to have a series of conversations with people like you, right, where we have our theories of Trump. Hers was kind of articulated in the basket of deplorables remark. It's interesting to talk to you about that because, as I said, you broke the Romney 47% story where he said, look, 47% of Americans are hopeless. They just want to hand out and don't pay taxes. They'll never vote Republican. People have compared Hillary's remark, her deplorables remark, to Romney's. So before we get started with the deep psychologizing, I'm wondering what you think of that comparison. Were you immediately struck?
Yeah. I don't think there's a strong parallel. To begin with, part of the power of the 47% remark was that it was something that Romney said in a private moment when he didn't realize he was being recorded or that this would become a public matter. So it was sort of Mitt unplugged, and it was him talking to a bunch of very, very wealthy donors who basically were saying, what are we going to do about these people who just want to freeload off of us?
Right.
And Mitt Romney, in his very technical manner, said, I know exactly how many there are. 47%. I mean, we don't have to get into all the details why he chose that number. And he sounded very unempathetic with a great many Americans who work hard, who might have to use government services, but he made them all sound like they were lazy, good-for-nothing, maggots. And so I think that it had the power because it was an insight into how he really saw the world that he wasn't willing to share with the world. While the basket of deplorables comment was not said in private. That was something that Hillary Clinton,
she
believed.
She knew the cameras were rolling. It also wasn't like Obama's bitterly clinging to guns and religion remark.
And also, when she said many, a majority, a half, whatever she said, she's referring to a subset of a subset. And I do think that you can make a case that technically she was right. Whether she was right to say it politically, she was right to say that if you look at Trump's supporters, a majority of them believe notions that have some element of racism to them. And by that I mean that if you take polls of Republicans, you find, depending on the polls, but often a majority or close to a majority believe that that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. They believe the birther argument, and they also believe that he's not really a Christian. He is a Muslim, a secret Muslim. And then, this question doesn't get asked, but if you ask if he's also a secret socialist who wants to destroy America and its values, I'm sure you get a high number of that too. So, but if that's a majority or close to a majority of Republicans overall, it seems to me a pretty sound assumption that that is a majority of Trump voters. And as my colleague at MSNBC, Katie Tur, has said over and over again the last couple of weeks, when she's been covering, I don't know how many dozens of Trump rallies she's covered, but she sees again and again people coming up to her and saying they believe there's something wrong with Obama, that he's not a Christian, he's not a Native American, that he does want to destroy America. So looking at that, looking at the alt-right movement that Steve Bannon, who is the CEO of the campaign, has sort of tied in now to the campaign, you put all that together, and I think those are deplorable ideas. Now, if you want to call people who hold deplorable ideas deplorables, maybe that's not the best way to go politically. But I think in terms of dealing with, and this is what you may want to get to, the motivation that's partial for some Trump voters, a majority of them are probably motivated in part, if not mostly, by some deplorable notion.
Okay, so here's you're getting to what I want to get at.
I know.
Because
helping you about it.
I know. This is why I bring you on and pay you to do this. Oh, did I forget to pay you? Anyway, this is why I bring you on. This is why I bring you on. But here's kind of leaving aside the question of whether, Hillary now says, okay, 50% was too high, it's some smaller fraction that's racist, whatever. My issue with the way she put this was, she said, okay, half of them, they're racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. Then she said, but the other basket, and she goes in, she says they feel the government has let them down, the economy has let them down, nobody cares about them, blah, blah, blah. So she gets into what the causes are that have led them to have this position. Whereas with the racist, she doesn't ask the question, well, what makes people racist? Why are they racist? Why are they xenophobic? And I think you should seek the causal roots of both populations, right?
Well, that's a question. One thing I left out of my basket of deplorables is that a majority of Republicans also, have supported Trump's Muslim ban, which you can put in the bigotry basket or the xenophobic basket. And that's certainly half of his support. Now I see where you're going with this, because you're getting to the issue of whether racism, xenophobia, ethnic bigotry, throw in sexism if you want, is the root cause, or whether something is causing that, something that is rootier.
There's a reason people become racist. I don't think they're born with a racist gene, whereas others aren't. So,
well, that may be true, but also, you're getting very close to, I think, the Marxist theory that bad economic circumstances causes people to become tribalistic or racist, or look for scapegoats of people to blame who may be closer to them.
Well, the answer doesn't have to be economic. I mean, you're right. I'm looking for root causes, and partly just for the sake of consistency. Because when we're talking about terrorism, and people say you don't understand, he's just an Islamic fundamentalist. That's the end of the story. I'm like, well, no. There's something that turns people who are not extremists into extremists,
Right.
and it behooves us to understand that. And I'm just doing the same thing here. So
Right.
now. I was going to say something. Yeah, it's not, the causes aren't necessarily economic. Now, there was this, did you read this piece by, I guess it's Zach Beauchamp? It looks like Beauchamp.
Beauchamp, but it's
There was a piece on Vox that got a lot of attention a couple days ago where he used the work of this academic who actually is going to do one of these conversations with me. But he drew on the work of this guy at, I think, MIT, to argue that a lot of it is an kind of an ethnic-based resentment about changes of power. My group used to be in charge in this country, and Zach was arguing that this is a better explainer of these attitudes than is economic dislocation. If you actually look at the numbers,
I would call that the Pat Buchanan view. Years ago when Pat was more notorious, and there were questions about whether he was anti-Semitic or racist. He wrote books. It seemed to be almost pro-Hitler. That's an exaggeration, Pat. I love you. There were, people were trying to, explain, and he did well in the '96 GOP primaries in New Hampshire and elsewhere, trying to figure him out and figure out his appeal. And at that point, to me, and I knew Pat very well from working with him and being on shows with him for years, dealing with him personally, that I thought he wasn't racist or anti-Semitic in the sense that he didn't like blacks or Jews or people who were not of his denomination. But I saw him as a tribalist,
right,
who grew up in a certain way, Irish, Catholic, upper middle class, when they kind of ruled the day. They got the good jobs, they got to the schools they wanted, and that, sort of make America great again would be going back to then when your tribe, your team was in charge. And also the way I believed he saw the world, probably still does, is that it's kind of a zero-sum game. That there are X number of tribes, and there are sort of new tribes every day or year, and that they're all competing for a slice of a pie that's not getting bigger. And now, I'm talking about in the 90s, 20 years later, maybe that pie in some ways is getting smaller. And that's always informed my thinking when I try to, consider and ponder the questions that you're posing here. I mean, I do think, and God, someone who knows something about evolutionary biology might help us here. But, I do think there's some programming that causes humans to be tribalistic and to think in group terms, group dynamics, and we all know why that is, and it made sense once upon a time. And I do think as people feel more economic pressures because of things happening with our own economy, but also largely in the last 10, 15, 20 years because of globalization, that they, I don't want to say cling to their group like they would to guns and God.
They bitterly cling to their group.
Bitterly,
guns,
but I do think that that's a natural impulse in a lot of ways, and we live in a country that is incredibly diverse, and it's also just like really big. I mean, this is a big country geographically, and New Hampshire is really a lot different in look and feel than Arizona, and to sort of try to find, we all talk about American values and national identities, but we see in Europe and other places that these things are really hard to hang on to or cling to in that sense if there are other economic and social pressures on, which sort of may cause people to hunker down, at least psychologically, within their own group. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of research in the past couple of weeks about the rural vote versus the urban vote and how Trump's doing so well there. I mean, when I was, in the primaries, I haven't been on the trail recently, went to Trump rallies, you did get a sense of people feeling, sort of us versus them, whatever the us might be. And that this was for them somewhat of a civil war. I mean, it really, really was. And that, they were buying Trump's terms of the debate in a very emotional, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, passionate way, without even looking at the person defining the terms. Like, they almost didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone saying this. And so, I mean, anyone who's been married will probably have a sense that, I feel like the political debate in this country is, are maybe two sets, or maybe more, of citizens just arguing completely past each other in different terms with different desires and hopes and expectations about what politics and government is or
I can't relate to that. My wife and I never argue, much less past each other.
I bet.
29 years of bliss.
Good. You should write a book.
28 or something. Yeah. Well, speaking of books, can I do a little digression on this? The question you raised?
I hope that was part of an answer.
It was. And it gets to, I mean, you're bringing up this groupishness of humans and the zero-sum perception. I think both of these are totally compatible with evolutionary psychology, which you alluded to. I mean, first of all, the finding from psychology generally is that, yes, people are just inclined to be groupish. I mean, they can take young kids and put, like, pink jerseys on one and blue jerseys on the other, and although there's actually no common interest, there's just this, they do start grouping together in their colors. Other studies have shown that nothing binds a group like the perception that their own relations internally are non-zero sum. In other words, they face some challenge that they need to overcome together, and especially if that challenge comes in the form of another group with which they have a zero-sum relationship. There was a famous experiment decades ago. You couldn't do this now for ethical reasons, but they took boys in a summer camp who didn't know they were in an experiment. There were two camps. Okay, there were two camps. Yeah. And first, they cultivated hostility by, they would, let one group come to the picnic first and eat all the food, then the other group would get there and go, they ate all our food, and it got to the point where they just hated each other.
That was a summer camp I went to.
Yeah, okay, but tell me if the rest of this happened at your summer camp. Then they engineered these fake crises afflicting the entire group, they told them the water pipe bringing water to the camp has broken down. And then the groups would get together to solve it, and suddenly all these guys who had fights were suddenly friends. So you're exactly right. We are groupish by nature, apparently, and a critical thing is the perception of a zero-sum dynamic with another group. And I think part of the question is which zero-sum dynamics are most important here? What do they perceive? In what sense do they perceive themselves as under threat, or what is the zero-sum game here?
Well, I think there's been a shift in what you might call the post-World War II, if not consensus, assumption or expectation. And I'm talking about people, say, middle class and above. The poor always get screwed. Let's just, and that's unfortunate, and they don't vote in the numbers they should vote, and they're disenfranchised and often marginalized and disengaged. And in terms of politics, are underserved and underrepresented and underplay. But if we're looking at people who are not in poverty, anything above that I do think, there was this assumption that grew about in the decade or two after the war that you can go to high school and not even have to go to college. And you could, get a good job in a factory, in a mill. The Monongahela Valley outside of Pittsburgh is a great example. Make a lot of money. I mean, more than than your parents did, and take your vacations, have a boat, have a car or two, and have enough money to send your kids to college if they wanted to go. If they didn't want to come work in the mill. And that there was a sense of progress, that you were doing better than your parents and your kids would do better than you. And if you wanted to stay in that sort of conventional path, by and large, you could. Okay? And in the last 30 years, basically, our adulthood, that is frayed. It's frayed in more places, in some places more than in other places, in some careers more than other careers, affecting some demographic groups more than others. But, now, it started kind of in the Clinton years. I remember with Robert Wright talking about permanent education and permanent training. We're just going to, the world's shifting. We're going to keep training people. If we train them, the jobs will come. And the problem with that was a lot of people don't want to be trained when they're 35, 40, 45, 50, 55. They don't want to be in a world that is dynamic with companies coming, rising and falling and needing to change. They want, they don't want 401ks. They like a pension. They like to count on things. And that sort of basic static way of living economically, which, I think a lot of Americans were able to benefit from, has slowly dissipated or disappeared. And so, I think there's just a general freak out. Mm-hmm. You don't know, even if you got a good job now, at a startup or at an existing company, there's no sense of security in the long run. There's no sense of economic retirement security. The healthcare system is better under Obamacare, but it's still, pretty awful to deal with. So there's no sense of medical security. We see in the polls again and again, people don't have a sense of security for their kids if they have kids. Not everyone does. And we see a lot of this is from globalized economic pressure, and no one has a really good answer for it. I mean, Trump has an answer. I will make it better. He just promises the moon. I will bring jobs back. I will make America great. I will go back to the time that I just described, where you didn't have to worry about losing your job when you're 55 years old, 50 or 45. And anyone who's grounded in reality, which includes Hillary Clinton and others, have to say, can't make those gigantic promises. You can there are things that can be done, economic infrastructure, better investments, education. This requires taxing and moving, wealth around and trying to generate wealth. But it's a complicated matter, and it's hard to get consensus on that. It's much easier just to say, I can make America great again, bring it back to a time when you didn't have to worry so much. Now, in those days, things might have been worse off for Hispanic Americans and African Americans and others. Well, so be it. But that's not who Trump is talking to, and those are not the constituencies that are responding.
Okay, so now you're sounding like a Marxist because you're emphasizing pretty much entirely economic variables here.
Well, I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, I think, but in addition to that change, that foundational change in which you don't have the foundation you think you had, mm-hmm. The cultures, the country is becoming more culturally diverse. I mean, there's these other things that are changing. Whether it's how you regard marriage and loving relationships. Although, Trump isn't playing really the conservative card on social issues. I mean, he may sign up to some of them so he doesn't piss off too many Republicans, but his base does not seem to really care about that. Well, there are parts of his base.
Yeah, actually, you're right. I mean, my sister's an evangelical who supports Trump, so you're right about that.
Phyllis Schlafly, and putting out, saying that he wants Scalia. He's going to revive Scalia from the dead to be on the Supreme Court. Is talking to those people. But so you have those, you have the change in some social values. You have an influx of immigrants and people who are not white, which is changing the look and feel of parts of America. In a very crass way, when I went to some of these Trump rallies early in the campaign, I got the sense that these were people who are most upset about having to push 1 for English and 2 for Spanish. Mm-hmm. And so, so there's a lot of, shifting going around. And I think the American national identity is changing. And if that's changing at the same time, you have less economic security. Mm-hmm. I don't think people sit around and say, well, I'm supporting Trump 30% economically,
Right.
20% because I think English should be the first language, and I don't like having to explain myself twice when I go to the Denny's. 15% because I'm still not sure about gay marriage. I mean, I just think it leads to a lot of
Well, also
books.
there's an interdependence among those variables. I mean, if you're feeling very economically anxious, it's just more likely to like annoy you that you have to press one for English, or if you see some guy from Mexico doing a job down the street, a gardening job, even if gardening wasn't your line of work, you're going to be more inclined to latch on to that. That's just human nature. So
Yeah.
there's an interdependence among all these variables that makes it very complicated. And in fact, that's one thing I didn't. In a way, I'm just restating the point I made about Hillary's dichotomy. But in this Zach Beauchamp piece, if that's the way you pronounce it, at Vox, he kind of said, look, it's not economic anxiety, it's xenophobia and bigotry. But economic anxiety can lead to xenophobic attitudes, obviously. He acknowledged that probably somewhere. But I think.
I mean, I don't know. Have you seen any social science on this? I wonder, too. I mean, because Trump keeps playing up the crime business. And that, crime rates in general are not at a historic high.
No, compared to
right?
10, 20 years ago, they're low.
But I'm wondering if people get more sensitive to crime if they're feeling economically stressed out. If if there isn't, and it's some sort of connection there too, because you do see him trying to really play that up, and his supporters at least seem to be responsive to that. When other people don't feel as if crime's the problem that it was, say, in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, there's two issues there. I mean, part of it could be, I guess if you've decided to blame Mexican immigrants for your economic problems, and look, there are zero-sum situations for jobs. There are cases where you're competing for a job with an immigrant. That can happen. But in any event, if you've decided to blame the group for your economic troubles, and then Trump says, by the way, they're criminals, that you just find that appealing. I mean,
Yeah.
that's also part of human nature. Once you've decided you dislike a group and you see the relationship with them as zero sum, any unflattering characterization of them, you're going to latch on to. So there's that.
And that works a little bit too, in the sense that we've had crime is not at an all-time high. We've had some horrific acts of terrorism here.
Yeah.
But again, nothing like has happened in Europe. And yet you have a majority of Republicans and probably a supermajority of Trump supporters saying a reasonable response to this is the unconstitutional step of banning Muslims from entering this country, which to me is such an indicator of where those people's heads are at. If you're going to, it's because it can't work. It can't work. It's unconstitutional. It is just, one of the most absurd policy proposals a presidential candidate has ever expressed from a major party. And yet, it wins support for Trump, and his supporters support it. And even if you looked at the exit polling during the primaries, a majority of other Republicans who are not supporting him still supported this idea.
Well, and not only leave aside the constitutionality,
and they're not even, and the Muslims aren't stealing the jobs; it's the Mexicans. But,
right. Well, the other thing is, I mean, if you look at what does motivate what Trump wants to call, whatever he wants to call it, I'm willing to call it Islamic extremism, whatever he wants to call it. But if you look at what does motivate that, what does drive like young Muslim men toward that, it is again a perception of a zero-sum relationship between their group and another one, specifically in this case the idea that we are at war with Muslims. This New York bomber, rightly or wrongly, probably, might well be wrongly, but he was under the perception, as was his family, that they were being discriminated against in their neighborhood because they were Muslims. The point is, this perception drives people towards extremism of various kinds. Yeah. So the idea banning Muslims from coming into the country. The idea that that's going to make Muslims who are already here less likely to commit terrorism seems to me kind of the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, well, that is, and this is what what has been, I think, discouraging to many people about Trump's success is that his policy proposals, and I use that term exceedingly lightly, that his policy proposals are not really proposals. They're ventings. They're emotional expressions. We're just going to get the jobs back. I mean, the only policy proposal that he has that he really can talk about, that he knows that he seems to care about, is the wall. Yeah, he has a tax plan and he can read a speech about it. Yeah, he's done foreign policy speeches, but there is nothing in the whole year and 3 months, whatever it's been, that he's been a presidential candidate, that he's talked about in which he seems to have any true interest in from a policy perspective other than the wall, which kind of makes sense because he did build things, he did build buildings, but and that's about even though there is somewhere a plan for the wall, it still seems to me to be an emotional metaphor more than anything else. So what do you do when your neighbors, and there are millions of them, feel put upon or ill at ease or don't trust the institutions that help govern our world to such a degree that really what they want is someone who is expressing negative emotions, and they relate more to how he says it than exactly what he says. I mean, this whole idea that you could, that he's strong and he can deal with ISIS when he says he doesn't have a plan.
Well, he says he has a secret plan,
but he won't tell us the plan. But he will fire all the generals. But first, he's going to ask the generals for a plan of their own. I mean, there's I hate to say this, there's a fair amount of irrationality that runs through a lot of the Trump campaign and what I perceive to be its bond with voters. And that, to me, is discouraging. And it's discouraging to me that I see it in those terms, because for, 30 years that I've been doing the type of reporting I've done, I've always tried to understand why voters vote the way they vote, even when I disagree with those choices, or and I think they might think they're the wrong choice. And this time around, I have a hard time being empathetic, because
that's what I'm here for, David. I'm trying to help.
Because when I look at Trump, I don't understand why anybody else in the first 15 seconds doesn't peg him as a con man, a huckster who doesn't believe in what he's saying, and he's just using you for his own ends and kind of playing everyone for suckers. And that no matter what, that's like,
right,
that's the first thing you know about him and you need to know about him. And then if he says stuff that resonates, or he's angry the way you're angry, I mean, who the heck cares? Because he's not an honest
This
person.
has been my surprise. I
don't like thinking that way about fellow voters.
Right. Well, but here's the reason.
I have a hard time accepting.
Here's the reason it surprised me. I have lived my life under what is apparently the illusion that I understood Middle America, and the reason is that, like, my roots are kind of not East Coast elite. My parents were from West Texas farm families. My father joined the Army. We moved around the country. My parents were not like intellectuals or anything, and my dad, I just think, they're not alive anymore, but I just imagine them seeing Trump on TV. They would hate him. They would, because he's just incompatible with the values they embodied. They hated people who bragged. They hated people who treated other people, just disrespectfully, the way he did on the debate stage. Yeah, making fun of handicapped people. I mean, give me a break. And so they would hate, and I think my relatives... What?
Would they? I mean, all these people out there who have the golden rule, in yarn on their walls, and who, go to church and teach Sunday school and, and profess to have certain values, none of this stuff is turning them off. They're
No,
still.
I know. I just mean let's assume they saw him independent of political context. He didn't represent anything ideologically. I don't know how my parents would be reacting to the current political milieu, identity politics, and so on. And we should get to that quickly, by the way. But I'm just saying, if they just saw the guy on TV, they'd go, "What a jerk," you know.
Yeah.
And it has surprised me that more people haven't done that. And I think it gets back to what you said. These people are so upset about something that it doesn't matter. And in fact, there's something they like about how in your face he is, because they feel hostility toward the whole establishment that he's attacking, among others.
Can I cite myself?
You go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. At the beginning of the Republican convention, I wrote a piece called "Donald Trump and the Politics of Being an Asshole."
Right.
They got a good response. And it was based on talking to some people who'd been around Trump when he was deciding to run for president. And I'd asked one of them, okay, so at that time, what were the things about Trump that you were most worried about that could become fodder for opposition research? His marriages, his personality, his bankruptcies, his mob ties, his flip-flops, the birtherism. What were you worried about that could come out? Did you do your own opposition research on Trump himself? And I was told that Trump forbid anyone in his campaign to spend money to do opposition research on himself, which happens in most major campaigns. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I was told we weren't worried about any of that. I go, what do you mean? We weren't worried about what would come out about Trump. Our theory of the case, they told me, is that there are people so upset about where the country is and where it's going that they feel that the only person who can help is an asshole. Someone who will say whatever needs to be said. It doesn't have to be true. Somebody who will knock heads together, who will not be polite, who will not be respectful. And if this person in the past has said things that weren't true to get his way, as skirted rules, as long as he succeeded, that's what would matter.
We need General Patton.
Or a loudmouth like Donald Trump, who to most people looks like a tremendous success.
Yeah.
Even if he only has, $500 million instead of $10 billion, he still has a plane, and he used to have a yacht, but he has buildings and a wife who's better looking than yours. And
speak for yourself.
I mean generically speaking. And and is able to and can do and say whatever he wants. Doesn't have to be politically correct, which means he doesn't have to be nice and polite and decent. Mm-hmm. And so,
in fact, that's an asset, because there's so much resentment against the political class, with good reason, I might add. I think, but that the less he seems like a politician. It took us a while to get this early on, if you'll remember. He'd say this outrageous stuff, and you'd go, "Wait, they like that?" Of course, because a politician wouldn't say that, and that was the appeal. Now we have one thing we haven't talked about is a couple of things. This is a reaction to political correctness, and let's start there, because I think there was a Ross. Did you read Ross Douthat's column? I think it was today. There was a Ross column, and there was a column by Damon Linker, I think, at the Week, that were somewhat on the same page in saying, I think they were both either saying or implying, this is not about economics, it's not about X, Y, and Z, it's about this sense of kind of cultural domination by these elites who say, you can't say this, you can't say that. Ross, of course, emphasized this really quite radical movement in values on the social issues. Gay marriage 10 years ago seemed like a pipe dream.
Yeah.
And now you're excluded from discourse virtually if you say you have misgivings about it. This would be Ross's view. I don't think that's all that far off. It's happened very fast. And now LGBT is, now trans is the next thing, and so on. And so I think Ross was emphasizing the idea that, these people feel like they're just having a bunch of issues shoved down their throat, and there's a bunch of things they can't say. Of course, Trump comes close to saying them, and that works in his favor in their view. I mean, how much of
the question is I hate this debate over political correctness. I'm not going to be politically correct. What does that mean? You're going to be racist? You're going to say things about, and call Mexicans rapists? You're going to call a judge of Mexican descent a Mexican, not American? You're going to say, my African American? You're going to say African American, communities are worse off than they've ever been in the history of the United States? I mean, all these things, you're going to talk about the president's origins of,
okay, but let me give you a tougher example.
But I'm just saying, when people talk about political correctness, you can sometimes, there may be some areas where there is a semblance or a partial point, but often I think what they're talking about is areas which we would just consider rude and obnoxious and racist or sexist behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's not politically correct. That's just correct to not.
Okay, I think they would cite more marginal cases like a sportscaster remarking on how beautiful a woman is or something in the crowd, or some guy got into trouble for saying, yeah, of course, he's a star quarterback, naturally his wife's beautiful or something, which is, that actually is the way the world works.
Yes.
Or to take another kind of more marginal example, this Skittles thing, right? So Donald Trump Jr. says, the Syrian immigrant thing is like, if you got a whole, handful of Skittles and 3 are poison, you don't eat the blah, blah, blah. And people are like, are you calling immigrants Skittles? Well, if you look at the logic of the analogy, no. I mean, my big objection to the analogy is that the numbers were so far off. It's more like you got a mountain of Skittles and 3 of them are poisonous, right? So sure, I'll take a handful. But and I kind of see the case there that, look, it's the logic of the analogy is definitely not to compare the immigrants to the Skittles. It's to compare the relationship of one kind of immigrant to another, to the relationship between one kind of Skittle and another.
But when you look at at some of the Trump coalition, and when people are saying, we don't want political correctness shoved down our throats, some of those people are from the white nationalist alt-right, and some of those people are kind of like Ben Carson evangelical Christians, mm-hmm. who, don't accept homosexuality at all. And, how you tease that out, I mean, they're finding common cause together. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the white nationalists are homosexual. It's like we know what was true with Nazi Germany. But yet they're finding some common cause under this very vague banner of anti-political correctness, which mm-hmm. anybody can use to basically define, and to protect the thing they want to say, regardless of how hateful or wrong it might be.
I'm just giving examples.
And you can find, our society in some ways has become overly sensitized, and there are some discussions that maybe we should be able to have that we don't have, or that it becomes tough. We see this on a lot of college campuses. That story in the New Yorker about Oberlin, a year or so back, got a lot of people thinking about this, and the clash between a safe space mm-hmm. and a vigorous exchange of ideas. That's a tension that's always there, and I can understand that, but I think those are not that's not the way this issue is playing out for people who are flocking to Trump. And I do think there's a fair amount of cultural or racial resentment that is, purely negative, and that people want to cloak in anti-political correctness. We should, they don't like Muslims. Why don't they like Muslims? Well, you can try to tease it out, but for many, millennia, human beings have not liked people from other religions and other groups, and have been discriminatory and biased, and it's often led to terrible things. And so, this whole notion of we can't talk about spying on mosques because that would be politically incorrect. No, it's just wrong
and stupid and
stupid. It's also counterproductive. I mean, besides, we're not
it's
even,
worse than wrong. It's stupid.
Yeah, and so I don't know. It's just really hard.
Yeah,
to
no, I agree. I was just trying to give you
where
some
you want to
examples.
cut people slack and where you don't.
I was just trying to give you some examples where, in principle, a non-bigot could look at some things and go, "Wait, can't you say anything anymore?" Right? I mean, there are examples like that, at least on the margins of of the enforcement of kind of political correctness. And I'm just saying that's what they would say. But mentioning Muslims brings us to another kind of psychological dynamic, which is also a perception of a zero-sum relationship between you and another group, and that is fear, right? And the fear of terrorism. I mean, you've got fear of immigration, an economic issue. You've got fear of terrorism, a security issue. And I think in the latter has been more wildly blown out of proportion, in some ways systematically and purposely by media. I mean, Fox News, it just seems to me, has been on a crusade, if you'll pardon the expression, for a decade to make people afraid of Muslims. So that's
well, yeah, the whole notion, and this is what Trump's playing in off of. We have to call it radical Islamic terrorism. Now, the interesting thing is, you talk about being not just wrong but stupid. Which is who's doing most of the fighting against ISIS these days? It's the Iraqi army, right? We want to get Turks involved. We want the Kurds involved and all this stuff. By and large, these people do not go and say, we're going after radical Islamic terrorism. They don't want to, identify it as Islamic because they're largely Islamic. And to them, these are the bad guys. These are ISIS, Al Qaeda. And so, for Trump to say, I want to name it radical Islamic terrorism, so you get the I word in there, that's playing off people's prejudices, and it's counterproductive. It helps ISIS recruit, for people, and they show Trump doing that. Yet, for many Americans, for millions of Americans, it seems to be very satisfying, and it's unsatisfying not to identify it as such. There is no practical reason in the world why that helps you stop the New York City bomber anymore, or gives you an advantage on the battlefield against ISIS. As I've said, the argument is stronger that it does the opposite. And you made the point, too, about getting the Muslim community on your side. So this being basically the centerpiece of Trump's foreign policy, and how it resonates, it's a really big applause line. And it's not just him. I mean, the right has been doing this. People on the right have been doing this for a couple of years now as a way to, bash Obama. But what is it about putting it in those terms that is, as I just said, so satisfying for so many millions of Americans?
Well, once you're afraid of a group, you like belittling them and denigrating them. And the fear is there.
Yeah. Well, and this, I would not take a Marxist economic first, line on trying to explain this.
No, I think this is a fear first. This is pure fear. It's a security issue.
But it's kind of interesting how there are still more mass shootings in this country that are not related to terrorism.
Oh, yeah.
Than there are related to terrorism.
There's a hugely warped perception of the threat actually posed
and
by
we
terrorism.
Don't have that, and people, don't seem to be freaked out about becoming victims of that.
That's right. On the other hand, I mean, terrorism, there's a reason they call it terrorism. A little of it goes a long way in terms of instilling fear. It's the nature of the thing. It's random. It could happen in your neighborhood, even though there aren't crack dealers in your neighborhood, and on and on and on. But let me quickly, what about the perception that people like you and me hold, what about this as a driving force of Trumpism? The perception that people like you and me hold kind of Trump's demographic in contempt. So I had, Robbie George, the conservative intellectual at Princeton, I had him on talking about this, and he's from Appalachia. He's from West Virginia. And he says, he's not for Trump, but he says the reason he says the people there feel that they are the last group that it's legitimate to make fun of. You can make jokes about incest in West Virginia, but you can't make jokes about. I think this is true. I mean, you can't make a joke remotely like that about another ethnic group without being expelled from polite liberal society. You can make a joke about incest in West Virginia.
Well, I hadn't realized that was a major problem.
Well, I mean, this is why we're talking about this. But, when people...
listen, there are different types of elites in the United States and in any country. There are financial elites, cultural elites, political elites. There's sometimes overlap, sometimes not overlap. And, the guys who were behind the subprime crisis certainly were looking down, on Main Street and the rest of us, selling shoddy products and not giving a rat's ass about where it would end up as long as they got rich. And, there are, I guess there are religious elites as well. And I can understand why anybody who doesn't live in the mainstream of elitism will feel they're being played for fools. But, Hollywood is governed not by liberal principles, but as much as trying to sell things to middle America, and movies, TV shows. I mean, HBO became a thing because it went, it appealed to a much smaller demographic. So, I mean, I understand, why people, in the Netherlands or in the hinterlands and not in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles might feel, cut off from things. But I don't. I mean, I would say that it's not like the liberal media, that's doing, that's marginalizing them. I would say in a lot of ways it is the financial powers that have indeed, to use Donald Trump's language, rigged the game a bit, and that politicians in both parties have gone along with that, including many of the people elected by the people who feel marginalized.
Yeah, I mean, I do think they could rightly look at the output of movies from Hollywood and say many more, there's more Brokeback Mountains than there are, I don't know, Gran Torino. I haven't seen that movie, but I guess Clint Eastwood is one of the few people they could hope might present things from their perspective. One of the few directors, right? I
don't know. Now, Fast and Furious, 13, 14, 15. I mean, the movies that come out of Hollywood now, the big ones are really about nothing from any
in particular
perspective.
Yeah. No, I think that's true.
Transformers. I mean, they're not upset about Transformers. People. And since cable TV now has penetrated 97% of households in America. Yeah. It's incredibly high.
Right.
People with the economic means have the ability, if they want to watch, NASCAR instead of PBS,
or what is it, Duck Dynasty, whatever that show's called.
Duck Dynasty.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In fact, I think that's part of what's driving the whole thing is that the cultural elites are losing their power. I mean, I think there's a rebellion afoot that might not have been possible 20 years ago.
Well, America has become more nichified,
right?
In politically, culturally, and religiously, and people are self-segregating. It's become geographic. Just because people are able to. It goes back to, to round our circle here, Bob, to the tribalism we were talking about at the beginning. Yeah. You can, you can, thanks to this wonderful internet-y thing that we got going here, people can find others who feel as good about things or as bad about things as they do, who have the same scapegoats or as they have, and engage less with people who have different opinions And therefore, the whole notion of coming together and trying to find common ground, let alone compromise, an idea that's pretty dead in the water in Washington, seems to have, spread, farther and wider from our nation's capital. And I think that's obviously a bad thing.
And in light of all this, my final question, in light of like maybe the extent to which this is technologically driven, the fact that terrorism is probably not going to go away anytime soon, economic anxieties aren't going to go away anytime soon, and so on. What do you think about the prospects for Trumpism after Trump? Let's assume he doesn't win the election, which I think he well could, but let's assume he doesn't. What do you see this? Where do you see this going?
Well, I believe that there will be others, most likely Republicans, who look at how far he got with Trumpism, and if he doesn't win, we'll say, well, that's because he was a con man. He didn't believe it. He didn't organize. He didn't spend money the right way. He didn't take out the right ads. He
had no self-discipline on Twitter and so on.
Yeah, no self-discipline, no message discipline, and that if I do this right, I can maybe win. I'm sure that's what Ted Cruz thinks these days, and I'm sure others will be looking at this too. And they may well be. There have been populist, surges of the right and the left, on and off, in the post-war years, and no one's truly won. Look at Perot. We mentioned Pat Buchanan within the Republican Party in '96, and then people try to come along and see if they can harness it 4 or 8 years later. And it's always been a little more difficult than you might assume or expect. There was nobody who could marshal the Republican populist anti-trade.
Yeah, but Buchanan was never polling at 40%. That was a different age.
Yeah. In 2000, after what he did in '96. So I it's not automatic to me. Things do shift and things do change, but there are clearly, at least on the Republican side, and looks like in the general election, a significant number of voters who respond to this, I would call it anger-driven, and some might add fear-driven, hatred or bigotry-driven argument. And now, Trump maybe is a special case. He's the showman. He had the celebrity. He had the, when I went to Trump rallies, a lot of people were drawn to him, because of what they thought about him. That they just would say he's a success. We need a success. We need someone like that. We need a businessman. We need, someone who has his own plane and who's able to, screw whatever woman he wants and have his own vodka. I mean, whatever it was. And I don't think one should underestimate how far that got him. So just because there's a potential popular force out there, it doesn't mean it will automatically be corralled by a given candidate. And it's quite possible that if you have 5 people vying for the same group of votes, it will splinter and not have, not be a full force hurricane again. But clearly, as you wisely noted, economic insecurity is not going away. The changing demographics of this country are not going to start changing. The cultural, I don't want to call it upheaval, but the cultural change that's been underway in America is not going to end. And so people who don't feel at ease with any of those, and people who are people who are driven by bigotry, fear, and hatred, and racial animus, are still going to be there, waiting for someone who speaks to them.
Okay. Well, on that On that ominous note, yes. Thank you for taking the time. Now you can get back to writing the kinds of things that Trump supporters view as evidence of contempt.
Yes, I'm working on a piece right now about Trump and the mob.
Are you?
Which is only, due to, being propelled by my elitism and not really understanding, the cultural significance of the mafia.
One of many issues that in any other election one might have expected to hurt the candidate more than it has hurt the candidate. But I nonetheless encourage all good reporting, including this. Thanks for taking the time, David. This was really productive, I think.
Always a pleasure, Bob.
Okay. Take care.